Good evening. Thanks for coming out on a, can I call it a beautiful fall day in Las Vegas? I think it's officially fall. As you know, we're here to talk about global climate change and economic development. I think it's no small piece of irony for those of us who were here and it's not news to say there was a long, hot summer in Las Vegas, but it seemed a little longer and a little hotter, and we bring our expert out and it starts raining. So I don't know if there's a cause and effect there. We may have to have you out more often. But we're here tonight and we're delighted to have our colleague Joshua Meltzer back. Josh is now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Congratulations on the promotion there. And Josh is an expert on climate change and international trade as well. And we try and be timely with our talks, and I think we got extremely lucky given the news about the Trans-Pacific Partnership this week. Josh has been talking to media folks around the country, if not the globe, on this. And we can talk about that as well as some of his, what he has to say tonight. So, Josh, let me turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Bill. Yeah, I think the senior fellow thing was consistent with the slight graying at the temples. So tonight I'm going to talk about. So this is a new bit of research that we're doing at Brookings. I'm doing with some colleagues, and it's actually a consortium of us and a group called the New Climate Economy. Some very large sort of climate change research organisations. One called World Resources Institute. ODI, the Overseas Development Institute in the UK, McKinsey, which is a large consultancy, and the Grantham Institute at London School of Economics, and Nick Stern, who is and runs that, looking at the way that two different, very important and significant global agendas, one on development and the other one on climate, are working in parallel towards, in a sense, different goals with different sets of actors, but are fundamentally linked in whether they're going to succeed or fail by the need to essentially build out an enormous amount of infrastructure over the next 15 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit around what both these agendas are doing and how infrastructure and the financing of infrastructure and the way this happens over the next 15 years will determine whether we are successful both on the development side and also on the climate change side. So just quickly, I'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but infrastructure needs estimates from now out till 2030 are in the order of $89 to $90 trillion. And so we're talking about everything from energy systems, transportation systems, so more compact cities, buildings, waste and water treatment facilities. And the key here is that whether this infrastructure is built in a way that's essentially sustainable will determine whether in fact we achieve our development goals and also whether we achieve the climate change goals, and essentially the climate change goal being keeping temperature increases below 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. So let's just think about, I'm going to talk a little bit about the link now between infrastructure and development to start with. So what is fundamental is that the way, the access to infrastructure and essentially infrastructure services are absolutely key for development. There's been studies which show that for every 1% of GDP in India that's spent on infrastructure, it has a multiplier effect of 2 in terms of growth and outcomes, and at the same time creates approximately 350,000 jobs. You can understand that your access to energy, your access to transportation is key in terms of growth and development. Whether you have access to clean water, whether you have access to sanitation is all fundamentally a product of whether the infrastructure is in place to enable that. Now, this year's been really important from both these fronts because last week there was the Sustainable Development Goals were finalised in New York. So this is the set of goals which are going to guide sort of the international community writ large in terms of development mobilisation between now and 2030. And there's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And if you look across these Sustainable Development Goals, infrastructure underpins a lot of them. So for instance, many of them are actually about building out energy access, about building out water access. And one of the goals, specifically goal 9, says that investments in infrastructure, transport, irrigation, energy and information and communications technology are crucial to achieving the sustainable development and empowering communities in many countries. So there's an explicit recognition in the SDGs of the role of infrastructure in achieving a whole range of the Sustainable Development Goals. So failure, why? So I guess the question is, what's the difference between infrastructure and sustainable infrastructure from the development perspective? So the basic idea is that if we continue down sort of the same development pathway, you get much poorer development outcomes and you get much poorer sort of human health outcomes. So sustainable infrastructure is key to actually achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So, the same development model leads to, similar outcomes in terms of congested cities, high levels of pollution, poor environmental outcomes, significantly worse health outcomes. And so the key here is the idea that you need to build out the infrastructure, but you need to make sure that it's sustainable. On the just shifting now to talk about the climate change front. So on the climate change front, infrastructure is also key. So essentially 50% of greenhouse gas emissions come from infrastructure. Whether we're talking about directly in the form of energy systems, indirectly in terms of, whether you are on, mass transit systems or driving cars, whether you have, energy efficient buildings or not, whether you're using, so the type and the quality of infrastructure has a direct impact on greenhouse gas emissions, and through that it has a direct impact on whether we achieve our climate change goals. Now, the other really important part of infrastructure, of course, is its lifespan. So most infrastructure that gets built locks us into a particular growth model for 30, 40, sometimes up to 100 years. I mean, you build a coal-fired power station today, its operational life is 40 years. So and the costs of changing that coal-fired power station into something more sustainable is significantly higher than building the sustainable option up front. So often if you build the wrong buildings, if you build the roads that are not going to be resilient to climate change, if you don't build cities in a way that can handle more denser populations and mass transit, you often lock yourself into those outcomes. And the concern is that as we ramp up the need to build out all this infrastructure, that if you don't do it sustainably, the world essentially gets locked into pathways which are going to completely be inconsistent with any realistic sort of climate stabilisation scenario. So the climate change agenda has also been progressing apace this year, and most importantly we have the Climate Change Summit in Paris at the end of this year, where there's supposedly there's going to be an agreement that's going to come out of this that's going to be binding on all the parties. There's been a commitment to mobilise 100 billion per annum in climate finance by 2020. So there's going to be progress along a whole range of metrics. Countries have, over the last sort of 12 months, been announcing the types of commitments that they're going to be taking to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. President Xi of China was in Washington last week, and in Washington he announced that China would be introducing a countrywide cap and trade system by 2017. So they're going to be pricing carbon. They've announced goals to have 20% of their energy sources coming from essentially renewable energy by 2020. They've announced $3 billion in financing to help other developing countries adapt and mitigate to climate change. So, a lot is happening. The United States has announced its targets and goals, and the list goes on. There's about 60 or 70 countries now that have come forward with their targets and their goals. So there's a lot of momentum and a lot of expectation that we're going to get something real this time in Paris. So let's look again then at what needs to happen in order to bridge this infrastructure gap. And I just want to talk a little bit more about the scale of this challenge here. So as I mentioned at the beginning, estimates vary, but we're talking around in the range of $89–90 trillion of new infrastructure over the next 15 years. So that is essentially doubling the capital stock globally. And on a per annum basis, we're sort of investing around 3 trillion, so we now got to talk about investing around $6 trillion per annum. And a lot of this new investment is now going to have to happen increasingly in the developing world. So whereas most of the infrastructure development sort of to date really has been in the developed world, we're going to see that, over 50% of that is now going to have to occur in the developing world, because that's really where the need exists. The developed world, has built out a lot of its infrastructure stock. The United States, interestingly, I think, will be building out, a significant amount of infrastructure over the next sort of decade or so as it addresses, roads and bridges and improves sort of water systems and the like. But essentially, it's going to be something that's going to be happening in the developing world. So let's get to the costs a bit more. So the estimates are about $89 trillion in terms of the cost of building this infrastructure. So the question is then, what does it cost to make it sustainable infrastructure? Now, one set of estimates is that the overall net costs of making infrastructure sustainable are really only around about a 4 or 5% additional fee. So if we talk about 89 trillion in investment, we're talking about another $4 or $5 trillion to make that investment sustainable. And that figure also does not include additional cost savings from building sustainable infrastructure, such as lower maintenance costs and the like. So there are estimates actually that if you look at the life cycle of sustainable infrastructure, you're better off from a financial perspective than building out the normal types of infrastructure. But that said, I don't want to sort of make this out that this is like an easy challenge in that respect, because that 4 trillion figure is derived from a combination of having to invest an extra $14 trillion upfront to make, for instance, whether we're talking about in renewable energy or to make buildings more energy efficient. But there are to be expected savings there in terms of a lot less being spent, for instance, on fossil fuels. So there's an expectation that if you can build out more renewable energy, for instance, you could spend $6 trillion less on fossil fuels, and you would also have a lot less capital expenditure if you make cities more compact. So a lot of different pieces have got to fit together to make this sort of $4 trillion a reality. And the other thing is, it's not for each individual infrastructure project. The upfront capital costs are undoubtedly often much higher than building out the normal infrastructure. So there are real financing challenges. And these financing challenges are compounded by the fact that, as I said before, a lot of this investment often has to take place in developing countries where investment is often riskier and more costly due to a range of factors, which I'll go into briefly. So now what I want to talk about, and this is part of the work that we're sort of doing now, is really thinking through this in terms of what do we need in terms of a financing framework to enable this finance to go into not only infrastructure but sustainable infrastructure over the next 15 years. How do you double global spend on infrastructure and make sure that it is sustainable? So part of the challenge there is understanding what have been traditionally the barriers to investing in infrastructure in the first place, because the fact remains that there is an enormous gap between what's needed and what's actually built at the moment, and that gap just gets larger going forward. And we see that in the United States. We know how hard it is here to build infrastructure, and this is an issue that gets magnified many times when you actually get into many developing countries. I mean, the only country that's probably been particularly good in the last 10 years at building infrastructure is China, which has had an enormous infrastructure spend going on there. But in most developing countries, the needs are absolutely not being met. And the challenges, there's a range of challenges going on there. And I sort of, break it down into both what I would call the enabling environment and then sort of the financial framework environment. The enabling environment is simply one where, a lack of a pipeline of essentially infrastructure projects makes it very difficult for investors and for governments to actually put money into these countries. So in a way, even though needs get identified, there's a complete sort of absence of turning that need into specific projects which are actually viable, which can then be funded. So there's sort of a lack of a capacity to actually build out a pipeline of projects which can then be presented to potential investors to have them built out. Another dynamic there in this enabling environment bucket, I guess, is what I would refer to as sort of, legal and regulatory sort of risk, where you have lack of, stable sort of policy environments, you have legal uncertainty, you have uncertainty about contract enforcement, you have poor judicial sort of environments, and that essentially, significantly increases the risk particularly for investors from other countries into investing in these countries, and that's a factor which plays out often across many developing countries. On the the financial framework side of the ledger, what we see is a range of sort of challenges in financing infrastructure projects. One of them stems from just the nature of infrastructure as an asset. So infrastructure, in order to actually build something, it's a very long project development life cycle. You have to identify where you're going to build it. You have to do a whole bunch of project preparation. You've got to get teams together to actually work on it. You then build it, and then it's something that needs to essentially be funded over its life cycle. I mean, as I said, these things could be 30, 40 years. And so what happens is that often infrastructure has got different risks over its life cycle. So at the very beginning of an infrastructure project, risks are very high. You're basically at a stage where you're doing project preparation and planning. You're trying to work through the legal and regulatory sort of barriers and requirements that are needed to whether it's building a road or building a new energy source or whatever. You've then got to build the projects. You have construction risk at that point, and that construction risk can be even higher than the preparatory phase. And then once the asset's sort of up and running, often the risk becomes less. I mean, it starts generating a cash flow, and it's a more investable sort of asset, but you have to get through these other risk cycles. But even at that stage, it's not necessarily risk-free. I mean, particularly in developing countries, you get, this is where some legal and policy risk becomes relevant, because, if an investor is going to be in a country for 30 years and essentially locked in, you want to make sure that 10 years later, the government's not going to change its policy framework and make that investment unviable any longer. You need certainty around the fact that consumers can pay for this infrastructure. So if it's a road, maybe there's tolls, can consumers pay for that? If it's energy, what's the rates going to be like in the country? Can people afford that energy? So there are risks that continue along the project life cycle. Now the challenge is that different forms of capital have different risk appetites in a sense. So there's a real sort of challenge in terms of matching up capital with the risk profile of infrastructure over its life cycle. So this has been like a real difficulty in terms of really building out to scale a lot of infrastructure. And a lot of this gets magnified when it's sustainable infrastructure. So as I said, you have higher upfront capital costs, so you need more money at the beginning. So you're essentially requiring, investors to take on more risk at the beginning. And again, if you're going to have more risk at the beginning, you have more risk over the project cycle, because you need to recoup that higher upfront cost. So again, the capacity to pay over the duration of the infrastructure asset becomes important. In terms of the other thing that is, in terms of sort of understanding, I guess, what we can then do to, bridge these, the financing gap, and essentially to overcome, what we need to do is overcome these barriers to financing infrastructure. And in order to do that, I'll just lay out briefly the landscape of sort of the types of investors in the infrastructure space and the way that they come together to try to make infrastructure happen. The key point, I think, is that the private sector is going to have to play a much larger role financing infrastructure than it has in the past. There's no shortage of capital in the world. If you look at institutional investors, so here I'm talking about insurance companies or superannuation funds, sovereign wealth funds and the like, that they have in total approximately $120 trillion under assets. Right? So there's a lot of capital out there, but for these institutional investors, an absolute fraction of that, around the order of $600 billion per annum, is invested into infrastructure. And this is where there is a need to find the way to mobilise a lot more of this capital to go into infrastructure assets. Now, part of the reason that we haven't seen a lot of investment by institutional investors so far is what I've essentially said before, is that these institutional, if you're a superannuation fund, right? I mean, you're managing, basically you're a very conservative investor. You've got demands on the funds from people retiring all the time, so you're constantly needing to match basically inflows and outflows, and you're managing money over very long periods of time. So you don't have an appetite for the type of risk, certainly at the beginning of an infrastructure project, that would allow you to invest into those projects. The other challenge for these institutional investors is that they tend to only invest in asset classes which are sort of scalable and large. So, an institutional investor that's managing, hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars is not interested in a $1 million infrastructure project or a $5 million infrastructure project. I mean, often, they're looking at asset classes which are liquid, and so you can sell them and buy them, quickly if you need to address, outgoings and liabilities. And also, they essentially only have the expertise, they build up the expertise to understand asset classes if the asset classes are worth investing in. And as I said before, one of the challenges with infrastructure has been that there's just not enough sort of essentially bankable projects which can be scaled up in a way where you can go to an institutional investor and say, hey, here's an asset class worth $100 billion of infrastructure projects with an understandable risk profile which you can invest in. It's often like project by project, it's too small for them to focus too much attention on. So we've had little from the private sector. At least on the institutional investor side. We have had, though, on the private sector side, some decent amounts of investment from essentially the corporate actors. So, you'll see that a lot of infrastructure is actually, built by the energy companies themselves on their balance sheets. So Shell will go and build a gas-fired, power station, or ExxonMobil will go and build an oil refinery. And so you do see, these project by project bases happening on corporate balance sheets, and that will grow. But it's not, again, going to be significant enough to address the gap. So we really need the institutional investor piece to come in. Governments have played a key role in multiple ways and will continue to play a key role in this space. One of the things that governments can do and need to do more of is improve enabling environments. So, governments are really the key actors in terms of, making sure that their policy and legal frameworks domestically are more robust and more consistent. And, governments can do that for their own domestic environments. And also, increasingly, we can see that, developed governments, country governments can actually support and provide the technical expertise and the financing to help developing countries actually develop this type of capacity and expertise. So a lot of this can happen, and so a lot of this happens through, development assistance, which government provides through aid budgets. It also happens through, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, through the World Bank and sort of like multilateral financial institutions, because they've played and will continue to play a very important role in this space. So in terms of the international financial institutions, the World Bank clearly an important player, but there's a range of essentially development banks in the world. So the World Bank's sort of the main global bank, headquartered in Washington, but there are a whole bunch of regional banks, right? So there's the Asian Development Bank, there's the African Development Bank, there's the Central American Development Bank, there's the European Development Bank, and there are also, in some countries, national development banks. We don't have that here in the US, but in Brazil and China, South Africa, very large, essentially, government banks which are focused on mobilising capital to invest in developing not only their own countries, but often they increasingly will also lend bilaterally to other countries. So the China Development Bank, an enormous development bank. Brazil as well has got a very enormous development bank that has sort of been a key financier of infrastructure. And so they're very important actors. Now they're significant because not only because they themselves fund infrastructure, but they can do two things more. They can fund more of it, they can make sure that the infrastructure is sustainable, and they can very significantly what's called crowd in private investment. So often what happens is again, if you look at the sort of the risk profile of infrastructure I was talking about, these banks are able and often willing to, say for instance, finance the riskier earlier stages, and in that process make it more attractive for private sector investors to come in for the later stage. They can provide the technical expertise to developing countries to improve their enabling environment, to increase sort of the attractiveness of broadly investing in infrastructure. And they can also include in their guidelines for access to their capital expectations that the infrastructure is sustainable. So they can basically set up conditions around access to capital, which include building out the most sort of sustainable infrastructure. So they have played an important role in this space, and they will continue to do so. Now, the last piece of this financing puzzle is going to be the climate finance piece. And this sort of links in again the climate finance agenda. So as I said at the beginning, there is a commitment now to mobilise $100 billion in climate finance by 2020, and there's a lot. There's decent moves towards that. There's a climate fund called the Green Climate Fund, which has now been capitalised under the UNFCCC, which is going to be one of the. And this Green Climate Fund has got $10 billion. This will you expect it to go out to $100 billion per annum by 2020. And given the important role of infrastructure for achieving climate outcomes, what we I think are going to need to see more of is the mobilisation of climate finance also for addressing all these barriers to building out sustainable infrastructure. I think I'll leave it at that. If you don't want to, so as Bill said, you can ask me about this topic, or happy to talk about. I mean, we had the finalisation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership on Monday, so if you have questions about that, I'm happy to talk about that as well.
Well, one thing, you said that many of these infrastructure projects are too small for institutional investors. Couldn't they be bundled?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. They could, and that's what we need to happen. The difficulty so far with bundling them has been that there hasn't really. So there are now some instruments that have been developed that allow that to happen. So there's specifically a thing called a green bond, which there's a couple of manifestations of it, but essentially one of them is that you have a bond which is backed by a whole bunch of different infrastructure projects across different countries with different risk profiles. So you sort of average it out, and then you have the bond, and the bonds are sort of got consistent, basically repayment schedules. I mean, bonds are, the most widely traded thing in the world, right? So, investors know bonds and they're comfortable with them. So if you can build out enough of these bonds, then that's one way of trying to bundle, and you increase liquidity and you put it into an instrument which institutional investors understand and can finance.
So in many cases, especially in the underdeveloped or rapidly developing countries, those foreign direct investment from more developed countries for the infrastructure development. Well, I think in that case, the foreign direct investors' main concern is not necessarily the sustainable infrastructure. Rather, they wanted to guarantee certain profitability out of their investment. Especially in certain countries, like in Asian countries and African countries, with the dictatorships, they focusing on the rapid economic development, there are common ground between these foreign direct investors and those political powers, and sometimes there have been some kind of issues with the rebate. And I think what do you think about some potential roles of this relatively new green climate fund or some other international development fund, which can be not necessarily directly invested for those the infrastructure, rather there can be certain role these international funds can play as more like oversight or supervising agency. So what do you think?
No, great question. So I completely agree with what you're saying in that if you're a private sector investor, absolutely. I mean, essentially, you're making a risk return calculation, and will continue to do so. So, and this is partly the challenge, right? Is that not only do you need to get the private sector to invest, but you need to you need to, at the end of the day, make sustainable infrastructure investable on that risk return calculation. The private sector is not going to invest simply out of altruism. That said, there are some changes underway. One of them is that climate risk is something that private investors are increasingly taking on board when they think about their investment strategies, and particularly for long-term assets, where climate risk is going to be increasingly relevant. So that's beginning to shape the way they think about investment opportunities and risk return profiles. And then there are other things that can be done actually to further incentivise the way private sectors invest. Part of it was what I was talking before, where at least now you're going to need other forms of finance to come in to make it attractive for the private sector. So you're going to need public finance, you're going to need climate finance, you're going to need development bank finance, which takes up, either reduces the risk of certain projects, takes up some of the initial overhead costs. Maybe. I mean, one way of thinking about it is, you have public money which pays for the incremental cost of making it sustainable, and then the private sector can come in behind that. And there are other sort of interesting sort of regulatory things you can do. So there's a few efforts underway to look at whether financial institutions should be reporting their exposure to climate risk on a more systemic basis. There's been some moves by the Bank of England to require that for companies listed on the stock exchange there. France is looking at doing that, and in a sense, you would hope that by reporting, exposure to it, you would also help, inform, investment decisions in a way. And so there's that. In terms of, and so I think that's the role, and that's, the Green Climate Fund, which I said is the major fund that's ultimately going to be capitalised under the UN process. I mean, this is not the only source of climate finance. There will be, even 100 billion a year in the context of having to spend $6 trillion on sustainable infrastructure a year is not all that much. So it's really going to be a question about how do you use the particularly the public monies that we have in a very sort of targeted way that will leverage and mobilise much larger magnitude of private money. And that's really the, I think, ultimate goal is, it's been demonstrated in the past that, for instance, the development banks, can through, small injections of capital, often mobilise. I mean, it all depends on the project and what's going on. But, ranges from, 1, 2 to 8 times the amount of private capital can be mobilised for, particular injections of a given sum of public money. So that's sort of the goal, is to do that, but you need to build out a framework which can do that on scale, which can sort of meet the infrastructure needs. Was that a question or no? Yeah.
So economic development and climate change, common theme. I mean, I remember when Al Gore and Inconvenient Truth came out. And, it's later on this year, the climate change talks in Paris. We still haven't really made a big dent in the human condition. And this is even more of a timely issue because tomorrow NDOT releases who wins the largest public works project here in the state of Nevada, Project Neon, $1.3 billion in capital investment. So my point is we're still investing here locally a huge transportation infrastructure project. But how is it going to be sustainable for the planet, but also in materials? How do you really change the human condition so we do have a long-term strategy for sustainability?
So this is the key challenge, and not wanting to. I mean, I'm hoping it's clear that it's a really hard one. Right. I think that there's momentum in the right direction. As I said, I think there's a lot. The fact that China has come out with very significant sort of commitments for still ultimately a very poor developing country, but the largest greenhouse gas emitter is I think a really big move. I mean, it's an enormously different place than China was in than when we had the UN Copenhagen Agreement, in 2009, where China didn't want to have anything to do with it whatsoever. The US has come out with much more ambitious commitments, and so the world, I think, is slowly moving there. But the challenges are absolutely still enormous. I mean, at the same time, I sort of expanding on your point. We are certainly, if you look at renewable energy, which is really the energy sector is really a key part of the infrastructure challenge and building it out sustainably. We have some really good stories on the renewable energy front where, really, wind has essentially, become competitive with fossil, powered energy. Solar under good conditions is also now competitive. But, at the same time, you're still seeing enormous investments in fossil fuel energy. Certainly not so much here anymore, but in India, in China still. I mean, even though China's moving to a lot more renewable energy, the energy demand globally is absolutely enormous. I mean, in India alone, there's about 600 million people who do not have access to any electricity, any energy whatsoever, right? So there's some really challenging sort of development imperatives which are going to come up against, the climate, so sustainable development imperatives. And so if you speak to, and I guess this is a useful way of just sort of, highlighting this tension, which is that, I mean, the developing country perspective on this traditionally has been, look, we don't want to hear about sustainability because, this is essentially a cost, and this is not a priority for us. Our priority is we want to get least cost energy out to our people. We want to build our cities in sort of the cheapest way we sort of can and the way we can afford at the moment. We'll worry about sustainability later. The climate change issue is really your problem. You created it. You solve it. The way that we are trying to reconceive this is much more as a win-win, which is sort of the way I was talking about this at the beginning, which is if you approach the cost issue on an appropriate basis. So if you actually particularly if you look at sort of the life cycle, what we call the life cycle cost essentially of an asset, you're better off building a sustainable asset than a non-sustainable asset. It's often more expensive up front. So that's the reality. So then if you have a situation where, building out, say for instance, the mass transit system is better than building out the roads, or building out the, gas instead of coal-fired power station is a better outcome, then you need to find a way to help developing countries finance at least the sort of additional cost of going sustainable. So if India says, look, we would have spent, $2 billion on a coal-fired power station, it's going to cost $3 billion to make it, say, the most, highly efficient, ultra supercritical coal-fired power station, then someone's got to cover that extra $1 billion. And so that's where, the financing challenge is going to come in, and it's got to be solved.
If I look at the equation for private investing or institutional investing in developing countries, there are two sides to the equation. If you have an institutional investor, they have to build in, besides their profit, the risk for government instability, corruption, which is endemic in a lot of the developing countries, and various other risk factors. The other side of the equation is it will cost a lot for these projects because all these other things have to be built in on the other end. Can the people that live in the developing countries afford the premium that will have to be paid to have these in those types of countries?
Yeah, so the demand side issue is really also a tough one. So this is sort of what I was saying before about, if you look at the life cycle, even once the assets are up and running, can they afford the electricity? Can they, if you're building a more expensive, climate resilient road, can they afford the tolls maybe that are going to have to be required? And, so there are different ways of getting at the demand side issue. I mean, in fact, if you look at so we've had some experience with, for instance, feed-in tariffs for energy, power purchase agreements, and these actually, where they've been in operation, and they were used obviously extensively. Feed-in tariffs were used extensively in Europe to encourage renewable energy, but they've been used actually across the developing world with various degrees of success. Power purchase agreements as well. They're both essentially commitments by the government to purchase a certain amount of electricity, and so they guarantee sort of the demand side. Now there's obviously a cost to that, and that's a cost which is again going to have to be built into the financing of the asset. I mean, you do need to get onto not only sort of the supply side issues but the demand side, and you're right, and all these other issues which you were talking about, the environment for investing in developing countries, which I was talking about as calling the enabling environment, is absolutely key here as well. I mean, the enabling environment in a sense is well understood. It's something that, as you were sort of, I think, saying, that, for foreign investment, generally it's been a risky proposition. And so, there's a lot of work that's been done to improve enabling environments. There's a lot of tools out there to address that. So, I think there's a good understanding about like how to get at that issue. And I think it can be done. I think the question's now going to be, how do we develop a financing framework which can actually make it happen at the scale that's needed?
I wanted to ask a question on the trade agreement.
Yep.
Have they resolved the issues around our pharmaceutical companies with the patents and the pricing in developing countries?
Resolved in that the agreement is final. So we don't know the details of the agreement. It hasn't been made public. I think we'll find that the intellectual property commitments broadly are pretty reasonable. I think that there was a chapter, the intellectual property chapter was leaked 6 months ago. So it's changed since then. But I think once people read it, there was a lot less concern about what it might mean. I'm assuming you're talking about issues around access to sort of medicines in developing countries and pricing issues there. Yeah, we know explicitly that as part of the agreement. So there was a deal sort of done in the WTO context on access to medicine, and this has been incorporated into the TPP agreement. And the deal basically allows developing countries to produce pharmaceuticals which are on patent, under certain conditions, and that's been incorporated into the TPP. And I think more broadly, there's more sort of flexibilities that have been built into the TPP around IP to sort of take into account some of these development issues. But we have to wait to see what the agreement's actually got.
Well, last question for anyone?
Yeah,
We can
well-
get to everybody, please.
Getting back to infrastructure,
Yep.
there's that really massive project, or potential project in Nicaragua, the canal that I believe China would finance entirely. Do you have any insights into that project and how it compares to others in terms of its implementation?
No, I don't. Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Over here.
Yep.
As a follow-up on infrastructure, for undergraduates and graduate students studying here at UNLV, where do you see the really big job opportunities coming out in the area of sustainable infrastructure?
So I think it's useful, so specifically around that, it's useful, I think, to think about this in terms of services. And, this can be, I think, it's an enormous range, I think. So this could be certainly, it's useful to think about, to break this down into sort of the infrastructure classes and the types of skills that are required for each one. And so increasingly we're going to see, I think, a lot of engineering, which can be specifically understand the renewable energy space, but not only the renewable energy space. I mean, in the United States, certainly gas is going to continue to play a very important role in the energy mix going forward. And you know, so there's those asset classes, and increasingly, you know, there's a lot of data and data analytics that is going to be part of, you know, this renewable energy space. I'll give you one example. Vestas, which is, you know, the very large wind turbine company based in Denmark, has got thousands of wind turbines all over the globe. All of these wind turbines have got sensors on them which collect data on wind speed, on, you know, load bearing, and all this data is transmitted back to Denmark. They analyse it constantly to work out when these wind turbines need to be, you know, maintenance schedules, whether there are wind patterns coming into the area, how do they maximise, you know, so the output from the wind turbines. So, you know, there's a lot of basically, you know, like computer IT data analytics around that, which you might not traditionally think of as, you know, sustainable development kind of job, but in many respects is. So I think you're going to see a lot of that demand going forward.
Don't want to miss anybody, especially behind me. Great. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Great, pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you for your questions. If you have an unasked question, we'll be around for a little while if you need to, want to follow up. We don't have a next lecture scheduled officially yet, so be checking your inbox for emails from me or our Twitter accounts and Facebook, and if we schedule something the rest of the semester, we'll be sure to get that information out to you. Thanks a lot.